On a rain-slick highway outside Crescent, Oklahoma in 1974, a white Honda Civic was found crushed against a culvert. Inside, 28-year-old technician Karen Ellison lay dead, a manila folder scattered across the seat and floor. 3 pages were missing. Police called it a simple crash. Yet the bruises on her arms did not match the seat belt, and toxicology records carried gaps no one explained. Her family asked why her locker was emptied, why her journal vanished, why a second set of tire marks curved beside hers. Rumors spread of plutonium, of documents worth millions, of a voice silenced. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. On the evening of November 13, 1974, the 2-lane stretch of Highway 74 outside Crescent, Oklahoma lay nearly empty. Headlights swept the cold asphalt at intervals, the sound of engines fading into open fields. At 7:30 p.m., a white Honda Civic pulled away from a Union Hall. Its driver, 28-year-old technician Karen Ellison, gripping the steering wheel with one hand and a manila folder with the other. Inside that folder, according to witnesses, were documents she claimed would change everything. She had told her colleague Mark Drayton she was meeting a New York Times reporter later that night. The folder never made it into any newsroom. The Civic was spotted at 8 p.m. passing a gas station south of Crescent. Clerks later recalled Karen's expression looked tense, her posture rigid, but she did not stop. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving thin streaks of water across the shoulders of the highway. Police reports would later note the absence of skid marks. At 9 p.m., a passing motorist found the Honda crushed against a concrete culvert. Its front end was compacted, windshield fractured into spiderweb lines, both headlights blown out. Karen sat slumped behind the wheel, lifeless. The driver's side door was jammed shut, passenger door dented inward. The motorist flagged down a sheriff's deputy within minutes. An ambulance was dispatched. The first forensic anchor appeared almost immediately. Tire tracks leading to the culvert showed an abrupt veer from the right lane, as if the car had been pushed or redirected, not slowed. The angle of impact suggested acceleration rather than braking. Deputies noted the seat belt buckle was unlatched, though bruises along her hip and ribs indicated she had worn it earlier that evening. At the crash scene, a state trooper retrieved the manila folder from the passenger side floor. Its cover was split, pages scattered and smeared with glass fragments. 3 sheets were missing, their impressions still faintly visible against the cardboard backing. Troopers collected the loose papers, sealing them in plastic evidence bags. No inventory was made public. By 10 p.m., the accident was declared closed for the night. Photographs were taken under artificial flash, the beams catching condensation in the air. The car was towed to a county impound lot, sheet metal screeching as it was lifted from the culvert. Karen's body was removed, covered in a plain white sheet, and transported to the medical examiner's office in Oklahoma City. Family members were notified near midnight. Laura Ellison, her younger sister, remembered the knock on the door and the uniformed deputy delivering the words "traffic accident." Laura later said the phrasing sounded too rehearsed. She asked about the folder her sister carried. The deputy shook his head and looked at the floor. Autopsy preparations began before dawn. Examiners noted bruising across her arms and neck not typical of seat belt compression. Small abrasions along her hands suggested defensive contact with another surface. Toxicology samples were drawn, though chain of custody records later showed unexplained gaps in documentation. By morning, the official narrative was set: a late-night crash, fatigue, distraction. But whispers spread quickly through the Union Hall. Colleagues had seen her clutch the folder, her voice urgent. She had promised evidence of safety violations, leaks, radiation exposures. Now the folder was gone, and with it, any direct testimony she could have given. At 8 a.m., local newspapers ran a 3-sentence brief: Lab technician dies in one-car accident. Authorities investigating. No mention of her name's connection to the Carrick nuclear plant. No mention of documents. Photographs of the scene were not published. The absence felt deliberate. That night, Mark Drayton returned to the culvert with a disposable camera. He photographed the gouge in the earth where the Civic had left the pavement, the pattern of tire tracks leading straight until the sudden curve. He collected a piece of broken glass embedded in the soil. Later, under magnification, faint traces of smeared ink were visible across its edge. The highway was quiet again, except for the hollow sound of wind across the culvert. At its base, wedged against the concrete, a torn sheet of lined notebook paper remained unnoticed. It carried a half-sentence in Karen's hand, 3 missing pages, 1 fragment left. The culvert held its silence. The last image from that night was the crushed folder, spine cracked open, 3 impressions of vanished words pressed faintly into cardboard. Under the glare of floodlights, the culvert where Karen Ellison's Honda had come to rest was sealed off with yellow tape. State troopers moved in measured steps, chalking outlines, photographing angles, placing plastic evidence markers across the damp asphalt. The car's crushed frame groaned as it cooled. Rainwater pooled beneath the front axle, carrying shards of glass into the grass. Deputies logged the discovery at 9:28 p.m., listing 1 fatality, single vehicle collision. But even in those first minutes, details strained against the official label. The Honda's headlights were destroyed outward, not inward, as if struck by force. The front bumper's metal bore parallel dents inconsistent with a simple crash. Tire marks extended in a clean line before veering sharply, no brake grooves visible. A sheriff's deputy, kneeling with calipers, measured the width. The spacing matched a second vehicle, wider than Karen's compact car. He logged it, then closed the notebook without comment. Inside the vehicle, deputies recovered her purse intact. Cash and credit cards remained untouched. The manila folder, its edges ripped, lay across the passenger seat. Several sheets were missing, impressions faintly visible on the cardboard backing. A photograph captured the folder before bagging, but no inventory was attached. Later, the absence would loom larger than the crash itself. At 10:45 p.m., Karen's body was transported to the Oklahoma City Medical Examiner. Under fluorescent lamps, the autopsy began. The examiner recorded rib fractures consistent with blunt trauma, but 2 bruises across her forearms suggested gripping, not restraint. A thin abrasion circled her neck, too low to be caused by a seat belt. Toxicology samples were drawn. Days later, results claimed her blood alcohol level was 0.35, near unconsciousness. Her sister Laura disputed it instantly. Karen didn't drink, she couldn't stand the taste. Chain of custody records deepened suspicion. 1 vial was signed out without time stamp, another logged hours after collection. The examiner noted in faint pencil, sample integrity uncertain. That note was later erased from the final report, though a photocopy preserved the words. At dawn, the wrecked Honda was hauled to the county impound. Mechanics noted the ignition was still in the on position, the fuel line intact. The accelerator jammed halfway down as though forced. 1 mechanic scraped paint flecks from the rear bumper, blue metallic, not matching Karen's white Civic. The sample was bagged, then disappeared from the chain within days. Meanwhile, Laura Ellison drove to the scene herself. She found wilted tire marks pressed into soft earth, still damp from the previous night's rain. Among the debris, she picked up a torn sheet of notebook paper half buried in the mud. Written across it in her sister's handwriting, "Meeting tonight, deliver copies, don't trust." The sentence ended abruptly. Laura sealed it in an envelope and kept it hidden from officials. Reporters arrived by the second day. Local papers ran a short notice. Lab technician dies in crash. No mention of the Carrick nuclear plant, no mention of documents. Union members knew differently. Mark Drayton, Karen's colleague, told a journalist that she had promised evidence of radiation leaks, falsified reports, unsafe waste disposal. Now she was gone and her notes had vanished with her. The plant's management deflected. A spokesperson insisted safety standards were exemplary. When pressed about contamination incidents, he replied, "No comment." But whispers spread among employees. Several admitted their urine samples had tested positive for plutonium. Others described barrels of waste buried unmarked in fields. None agreed to speak publicly. Ellen Rivers, an investigative journalist from Tulsa, joined the search. She requested access to Karen's locker at Carrick. Plant officials refused, citing security. Yet a janitor privately admitted the locker had been sealed after the crash, then reopened days later, the tag broken. Inside, shelves stood empty. It was cleaned out, the janitor said, not by us. Ellen tracked down witnesses. A waitress at a roadside diner remembered Karen idling in her car that night, staring into the rearview mirror for nearly 5 minutes. Another vehicle, a dark pickup, sat in the lot behind her. The waitress recalled the driver never exited, only watched. Minutes later, Karen drove south. Hours after, she was dead. The more they searched, the more forensic echoes multiplied. Photographs of tread patterns on the highway suggested a second set of tires swerved alongside hers. A mechanic's note about blue paint flakes. The janitor's snapshot of a broken locker seal. A toxicology record with erased handwriting. None aligned with the simplicity of an accident. At the crash site, Laura noticed something deputies had overlooked. Wedged in the concrete joint of the culvert was a small metal fragment. She pried it free. Under her porch light that evening, she saw it bore the stamped letters, GM, a manufacturer mark from a General Motors vehicle, not Honda. She placed it in a matchbox and slid it into her dresser. By week's end, the sheriff announced the case closed. Operator fatigue, the report concluded, but family and friends had seen the folder, the missing pages, the bruises that told a different story. The first search was finished, but beneath the culvert in the shallow mud where rain collected, a shard of broken tail light remained. It glowed faintly under ultraviolet lamp, its color a metallic blue. The fragment did not belong to Karen's car. Within days of the funeral, stories began to circulate. Local reporters, fed by anonymous sources tied to Carrick Nuclear, began printing lines about Karen Ellison's personal struggles. Some claimed she was an erratic driver, prone to distraction. Others whispered about drinking habits, about affairs with supervisors, about stress that made her unstable. None of it was documented. All of it carried the weight of a planted narrative. The company's public relations office released a statement suggesting the accident was tragic but not unexpected, citing stress and fatigue. A spokesman emphasized her alleged emotional instability. The words were repeated across newspapers, shaping the image of a woman unraveling rather than a whistleblower silenced. Her family reacted with fury. Laura Ellison, standing on her sister's front porch, held up high school yearbooks and work evaluations. This was not a reckless person, she told reporters. This was someone who kept lists, checked doors twice, measured her life in careful steps. Neighbors echoed the sentiment. Karen had been punctual, steady, meticulous in her habits. The portrayal of recklessness rang hollow. But there were stranger accounts as well. A neighbor across the hall remembered unfamiliar men visiting Karen's apartment the week before she died. They came late, wore dark jackets, spoke in low voices. One night she heard shouting, then the sound of a slammed door. Another resident recalled a black sedan parked at the curb for hours, engine idling. When approached, the driver rolled the window up and pulled away slowly. Investigative journalist Ellen Rivers tracked down an employee in Carrick's Human Resources office. He hesitated, then revealed a disturbing detail. After Karen's death, her personnel file was amended. A note was inserted suggesting disciplinary issues and erratic attendance. The handwriting did not match prior entries. Ellen obtained a photocopy. A forensic handwriting analyst later compared it against authenticated samples. The strokes of the inserted note leaned unnaturally forward, pressure uneven, loops inconsistent. The conclusion, forgery. Meanwhile, Laura went through Karen's apartment herself. She found a stack of unopened mail, utility bills, a calendar with penciled notations. On the date of her death, the word meeting was written, underlined twice. On the following day, the words deliver report, NYT. The meaning was unmistakable. Union colleague Mark Drayton told Ellen that Karen had confided about phone calls in the nights leading up to her death. The line would ring, silence on the other end, then a click. She had written down license plate numbers of cars parked outside her building. Mark never saw the list again. The false leads mounted. Company sources hinted she might have been suicidal. One article speculated her crash was intentional, yet no note was found, no history of depression recorded. Friends described her as determined, not despairing. She was scared, yes, said Drayton, but scared people don't give up, they fight harder. Ellen compiled fragments of evidence: the forged personnel note, witness accounts of strangers outside her apartment, calendar entries referencing a meeting. Every piece contradicted the company's narrative, yet the official line grew louder, troubled, unstable, unreliable. One evening, Ellen received an envelope slipped under her motel door. Inside was a photocopy of a security log from the Carrick plant. The log listed Karen's entry on the morning of her death, but in the margin, a second signature appeared, blurry, half-legible, not hers. The handwriting analyst later compared it with the forgery in the personnel file. The same uneven loops, the same tilted strokes. Implication was stark. Someone was manufacturing a paper trail of misconduct after she was gone. The deeper Ellen probed, the tighter resistance grew. A supervisor named Charles Breen dismissed her questions with a smile. Miss Ellison had her demons, he said. People like to make martyrs, but sometimes an accident is just an accident. His tone carried more rehearsed confidence than belief. Meanwhile, Laura noticed something unsettling at the crash site memorial. A bouquet of fresh flowers appeared, tied with black ribbon but no card attached. She asked neighbors. No one admitted leaving them. As darkness settled over Crescent, suspicion turned inward. Was the community complicit, preferring silence over scandal? Or was someone still watching, ensuring silence stayed intact? The rumors multiplied, but evidence cut through them like static. Forged notes, unexplained visitors, a missing list, a falsified signature. Late one night, Ellen developed film from a contact who worked near Karen's apartment complex. The photographs showed a grainy exterior shot, timestamped 3 nights before the crash. In the bottom corner, Karen's lit window framed her silhouette at a desk. But in the blurred foreground, across the street, stood a figure half hidden in shadow. The camera caught no face, only the outline of a man watching. By the 4th day, discovery arrived as a stack of quiet contradictions. At 8 a.m., Ellen Rivers waited at the Carrick nuclear gate, then taped a burner number under a town pay phone. At 1:05 p.m., the phone rang. The caller said he worked in radiological control. He refused a name. He said glovebox alarms at Karen Ellison's station had tripped 3 times in October and again the week she died. Logs sat locked in the safety office basement. Don't ask them, he said. Ask the clinic. The line went dead. The plant clinic refused aggregate exposure numbers. In the waiting room, a technician with a bandaged hand whispered that his urine bioassay once came back hot. He pointed at a door marked records and shook his head. That afternoon, Ellen met Laura Ellison and union colleague Mark Drayton at Karen's apartment. The air smelled closed and metallic. A coffee ring marked the kitchen table. Ellen unpacked a small kit borrowed from a university lab. Camera, labeled envelopes, sterile swabs, anti-static bags, and a portable alpha probe. She photographed the table with a scale, swabbed a 10 by 10 square in an S pattern, sealed the tube, logged time and location. She repeated at the sink handle, the refrigerator handle, the front doorknob, the nightstand switch, and a small ceramic jewelry tray. At 5:20 p.m., she powered the probe. The ready light steadied. A centimeter above the table, counts rose above background and held. The sink handle ticked higher. The front doorknob spiked. The nightstand read near baseline. She photographed the meter for each reading and bagged the swabs. They delivered the samples to the state lab before closing. A clerk stamped the receipt. That night, Ellen found a photocopied memo in the drop box. Incident 7, October. Positive alpha contamination event in Area B. Operator K.E. Heavy redaction swallowed the rest. A second page noted glove replacement variants, Box 14, Area B, dated the week of Karen's death. Both sheets shared a faint crescent blemish in the lower corner, a copper scar that marked a common source. The lab called the next day. Alpha activity sat above background on the kitchen table, higher on the sink handle, highest on the front doorknob. The control was clean. "We can forward for alpha spectrometry," the analyst said. Ellen authorized it. Mark asked if they should burn Karen's sheets. "Seal them," Ellen said. They packed bedding into contractor bags and taped them shut. The brass lamp from the nightstand wrapped in a towel would not fit. They set it aside. At 7:10 p.m. the burner rang again. A new voice said urine bioassays spiked in mid-October. A nurse was told to blame lab error. Area B dosimeters were reset, he added. "Ask who holds the reset key." The line died. A courier arrived at noon. Alpha spectrometry confirmed transuranic contamination on the table and doorknob swabs. Energy peaks matched plutonium isotopes used in fuel fabrication. The analyst noted that doorknob counts suggested hand-to-surface transfer. The vacuum bag swab taken later showed lower activity. Controls remained clean. Ellen sent duplicates to a university lab out of state for confirmation and bought a second probe. As a check, she swept it over neutral surfaces, Mark's toolbox, her car hood. Both stayed near background. Laura called that night. "Can you bring the meter?" she asked. They drove to her house at 9:30 p.m. The hall table and coat hooks read quiet. The front doorknob was slightly high. Ellen set the brass lamp on the floor and passed the probe across it. The needle lifted and held. She photographed the dial and logged the reading. The second lab called the next morning. Their spectra confirmed alpha contamination consistent with plutonium on the kitchen and doorknob swabs, trace on the jewelry tray. "Household Geiger counters underdetect alpha," the analyst warned. Ellen had used alpha-specific wipes in spectrometry. It was enough. Ellen and Mark carried the reports into the sheriff's office. The deputy skimmed the first page and slid the file back. "Federal," he said. Ellen asked about the missing pages from the manila folder. He looked at the clock. That evening, the drop box held an internal maintenance request. Box 14 glove replacement variants. Reason: tear during sample transfer. Supervisor: CB. The slanted loops in the initials matched the forged note in Karen's personnel file. The request date fell the morning before the crash. A retired plant mechanic explained that a variant signaled unusual glove changes, often after contamination. Box 14 sat in Area B. A supervisor's initials meant direct oversight. He pointed to the request number. "Sequence is off," he said. "That digit puts it after her death." He tapped the paper. "Someone backfilled this." Mark fetched an old punch card and laid it beside a printed schedule. The purple stamp showed glovebox maintenance at 3:10 p.m. The schedule showed no maintenance that afternoon. Ellen photographed both. Laura asked Ellen to check the nursery. A small bed sat under a moon-shaped nightlight. The rug and dresser knobs read quiet. The headboard climbed and held. The nightstand pull climbed higher. Ellen lifted the probe and the count dropped. "What does that mean?" Laura asked. "Transfer," Ellen said, "from a hand that carried particles." Laura remembered placing the wrapped brass lamp on the bed while she rearranged boxes. She pointed at the headboard rail. Ellen wrote that down, bagged the pillowcase and drawer pull, labeled each with time and location. The next morning, a physicist at the university confirmed the spectra fit plutonium used in fuel fabrication and said elevated counts on a household doorknob indicated recent contact. "Check where she kept her keys," he added. At dusk, Ellen returned to Karen's apartment. A shallow dish sat near the door where a key ring would rest. It was empty. A faint ring of dull metal stained the ceramic. She swabbed the ring, sealed the tube, and swept the probe across the rim. The needle lifted and held. She carried the dish to the table and photographed it beside the spectrometry plots. The story was no longer only a crash. It was a path. Plant to hand, hand to metal, metal to home. Ellen drafted the lead. Contamination logs, glovebox variants, forged initials, household alpha. Her editor cut adjectives and underlined numbers. "Publish what you can prove," he said. At 6:40 p.m. the burner rang. A whisper said, "They will call her reckless. They will call you wrong." An hour later, a photocopied badge decimeter log slid under her motel door. A reset notation appeared the week before Karen died. The reset initials matched the variant's initials. The copier's crescent scar marked it as kin to the other pages. Ellen filed chain of custody attestations with the lab, faxed a summary to the sheriff, and mailed Laura fresh gloves and sealable bags. They met at the apartment one last time that week. In the entry tray lay a single loop of thread, silvered with dust. Ellen lifted it with tweezers and sealed it. The alpha reading on the front doorknob had faded slightly, as if time and cleaning had lowered transfer counts. She wrote that down and took one final photograph in the pale blue nightlight. The Geiger counter ticked under the nightlight and would not stop. The union office sat on Main Street, a brick rectangle with barred windows and a basement no one bothered to use except for storage. After Karen's death, it became the focus of whispered conversations. Mark Drayton finally admitted to Laura that Karen had told him she left duplicate copies of her reports there, hidden away from the plant. She feared her apartment could be searched. The office, she thought, would be safer. On a damp November evening, Laura and Ellen descended the basement steps. The corridor smelled of mildew and damp paper. Fluorescent tubes flickered weakly overhead. Against the wall stood a row of steel filing cabinets. Dust outlined their handles. At the center, one cabinet showed recent disturbance. Its lock plate hung bent, brass edges curled back as though forced with a pry bar. A strip of yellow tape marked "Secured, Do Not Enter" clung loosely to the drawer, peeled at the corners. Mark explained that the basement had been sealed 2 nights before the funeral, supposedly for inventory. He never received a key request. He swore the files Karen mentioned were kept in drawer 3 of cabinet D. Now that drawer gaped empty. Paper scrape marks lined the bottom, a faint rectangle where folders once lay pressed flat. Forensic anchor came from the dust itself. Ellen laid a ruler along the floor tiles. Impressed in the dust was a partial shoeprint. The heel was rounded, the tread diagonal, unlike Mark's square-soled Union boots. She photographed it, dusted lightly with fingerprint powder, revealing the outline more clearly. The shoe size appeared larger than average, heavy, military in design. On the wall above the cabinets, a single fluorescent tube glowed unevenly. Laura noticed the pull chain swinging, though no draft passed through. She steadied it and saw faint smears of rust on her fingers. Someone had pulled it recently. They searched the rest of the basement. Torn fragments of manila folders lay scattered near a trash bin. One piece bore the printed header, "Radiation Incident Report, Confidential." The date line was sliced away, but part of the Carrick letterhead remained. Ellen sealed it in an envelope, marked with time, location, and description. Mark whispered that he had warned Karen not to trust the office. Too many keys circulated, too many ways for someone to slip inside unnoticed. Karen had shrugged, telling him duplication was her only defense. Now the drawer stood barren, the duplicates gone. As they ascended the stairs, Ellen noticed the main door frame scarred where a lock had been forced. The janitor admitted later he found it that way, but was told not to file a maintenance ticket. At midnight, Laura dreamed of Karen lifting files into the cabinet, her handwriting across the covers. She woke with the image of the empty drawer. The next day, Ellen carried the shoeprint photos to a local forensic consultant. He overlaid them with patterns from a catalog. The closest match was a government-issue boot used by contract security firms. "Not your average streetwear," he said. "This print belongs to someone trained to keep their steps deliberate." Back in Crescent, Mark found a shred of paper in the stairwell trash. It was a checklist form stamped with the Carrick plant logo. Columns labeled Safety Report Hash and Witness ran down the sheet. The witness column was blank. Someone had tossed it without initialing. The basement became a second crime scene, stripped but not erased. Lock plate forced, drawer scraped, paper shreds discarded, shoeprint cast into dust. Each element testified that the duplicates Karen tried to protect had been targeted, located, and removed. As they left the office, Laura paused on the threshold. A draft lifted the peeled yellow tape from the broken cabinet. It fluttered once, then tore free, landing on the concrete floor. The empty drawer yawned like a wound in the dark. Laura Ellison entered her sister's apartment for the third time in 2 weeks, armed with fresh gloves and a plastic container for evidence. The November sky pressed low and gray, rain streaking the glass. The air inside was stale, heavy with the odor of closed rooms. She moved carefully, scanning corners. Something about the bedroom closet had always felt overlooked. She pulled the top shelf boxes down one by one, stacked them on the floor, and sifted through. Old textbooks, a cracked lamp, a pair of shoes still dusted with factory grit. At the bottom, wrapped in a pillowcase, she found a hardcover ledger, marbled black and gray. The cover was warped by moisture, but the clasp was intact. She opened it with slow fingers. Inside, in neat block handwriting, stretched 3 months of entries. The journal began in August. The first pages described routine shift changes, glovebox readings, contamination drills. By September, the tone shifted. Karen wrote of late-night calls where silence answered her voice. She noted license plate numbers of cars parked outside. The digits repeated across nights, same vehicle returning, headlights cutting through curtains. Dark sedan, idling 10:45 p.m., one line read. Another, unknown man near stairwell pretended to tie shoe. Each entry included times, dates, initials of colleagues she suspected of falsifying reports. She described variance logs altered after glovebox alarms, inspections signed off before incidents were closed. One passage named a supervisor, Charles Breen, as authorizing glove replacements without explanation. CB initials again, she wrote. Same week as spill in Area B. Numbers do not add. Laura carried the journal to Ellen Rivers at the motel. They laid it flat across a clean towel and photographed every page. Ellen wore gloves, turning pages with tweezers. On the inside cover, faint smudges marked the margin. A fingerprint technician later lifted 2 prints. One matched Karen's, taken from her college transcript. The other was a larger male print, no match in family files. By mid-October, entries turned darker. Truck following 3 nights, she wrote. Called plant security, no record. Another page, phone clicks, long pause, then breathing. The final week detailed her plan to meet a New York Times reporter. She outlined documents she intended to carry. Contamination logs, radiation incident reports, urine bioassay results. If I disappear, these matter, she wrote. The last entry broke mid-sentence. Meeting tonight, deliver copies, don't trust. The line stopped there, pen dragged slightly, as though lifted in haste. Forensic anchor multiplied around the journal. Analysts noted indentations on one page where a letter had been pressed against the paper before removal. Using oblique light, faint outlines of words surfaced. Variance, glove box 14 CB. The same initials linked to forged personnel notes and altered maintenance logs. Ellen carried the journal to a university lab for chemical testing. Spectrographic analysis revealed faint traces of plutonium dust along the edges of 3 pages. Contamination was highest where Karen had listed incident numbers. Analysts concluded the journal had been written near active material, or dust had transferred from her hands while recording. Meanwhile, Laura described finding the journal wrapped in a pillowcase. That detail mattered. Contamination could spread to clothes, suggesting Karen knew she handled dangerous material. She wrapped it intentionally, sealing it from casual contact. The journal provided a roadmap. Each entry tied suspicion to names and times. Ellen cross-checked against shift schedules. Discrepancies appeared. Workers signed in when others recalled them absent. Safety reports marked complete before alarms triggered. Variance requests filed out of sequence. Each inconsistency bore the initials CB. Union colleague Mark confirmed Karen spoke of threats days before her death. He recalled her saying, "They will ruin me before they admit contamination." He recognized phrases in the journal word for word, but with revelation came risk. Ellen returned to her motel one evening to find her door ajar. Inside, nothing stolen, except the manila envelope containing photocopies of 3 journal pages. The rest remained. Whoever entered knew what to take. Laura refused to let the journal leave her sight again. She kept it in a locked box under her bed, carrying the key on a chain around her neck. "They already took her files," she said. "They will not take this." At night, she reread the pages, the handwriting tightening as weeks progressed. The last paragraph she memorized, its unfinished line echoing like a warning. Forensic technicians delivered one more detail. The unidentified male fingerprint on the cover bore a scar ridge across the loop, typical of healed lacerations. When compared with security staff employment records, one guard under Breen's command was noted for a hand injury that autumn. His name remained classified in official transcripts, but union whispers filled it. The journal became both evidence and threat. It connected plant practices to Karen's death with dates, times, initials, fingerprints, contamination. Yet officially, it was personal notes of no probative value. On December 2, Ellen received a package mailed without return address. Inside was a photocopy of a single journal page. The lines were familiar but altered, words crossed out and rewritten in different hand. The attempt at forgery was clumsy, loops too wide, pressure uneven. The message was clear: "We control the record." That night, Laura dreamed again of her sister, bent over the desk, writing with measured hand. She woke to find the journal still sealed in its box, pages whispering against each other like evidence breathing. The final image from Chapter 6 fixed itself in her mind. The last journal entry broken mid-sentence, ink trailing into white space. A voice cut off, evidence silenced. The list of names hardened slowly, one inconsistency at a time. By late November, Ellen Rivers' motel wall was covered in taped index cards. Each bore a name, a date, or an object. Together they formed a lattice. At its center were the same initials, C.B. The hinge connecting every discrepancy. Charles Breen, plant supervisor, 42, held no criminal record. He attended civic dinners, donated to the local hospital. His public profile was one of competence, but beneath it lay anomalies. A variance request in box 14 bore his initials, sequence out of order. A personnel file annotation describing Karen as erratic leaned in the same forward slant as the variance. A badge decimeter reset carried the same loops. 3 documents, 3 contexts, 1 hand. Union workers whispered of Breen's temper. He dismissed contamination alarms as nuisance noise. He reassigned guards at odd hours. He attended inspection briefings but never signed minutes. One man described him pacing behind glass during a glovebox spill, arms folded, expression blank, then later initialing the cleanup as if he had been absent. A second suspect was less visible. Records pointed to a contract guard with a hand injury. His name, redacted in official files, surfaced through payroll slips Ellen obtained from a sympathetic clerk. The slips noted restricted duty after an October laceration. The scar ridge across his fingerprint matched the partial lifted from Karen's journal cover. The tread of his government-issue boots matched the print in the union basement dust. He admitted nothing, but his silence bound him tighter than words. A third cluster formed around plant engineers. One Hargreave signed 3 glove changes in sequence, each with the same time stamp. Another, Wyatt, denied a spill but requisitioned new boots the same day. Their handwriting did not match the forged notes, but their actions enabled the variances Breen signed. They stood like shadows behind him, supporting structure without fingerprints. The strongest suspect beyond Breen was the vehicle itself. Forensic anchors tied the dark pickup to the night of the crash. Tire impressions beside Karen's Civic measured wider. Blue metallic flecks clung to her bumper. A tail light fragment pulled from the culvert bore GM paint code used in pickups of that model year. A waitress recalled the truck idling near the diner. A dispatcher remembered a call sheet. Pick up at South Lot. Follow until Crescent split. The initials on the sheet were blurred but carried the same rightward tilt. The sheriff dismissed the fragment as road debris. The county mechanic claimed the paint flecks were contaminated samples. Yet the lab report described a spectral match within 1% of the GM code. No accident placed a truck behind her car, only intention. Ellen compiled the evidence in a binder. Section 1. Forged annotations, variants out of sequence, badge reset with initials. Section 2. Security guard with scarred fingerprint boot tread match payroll slip. Section 3. Dark pickup paint code match tail light fragment. Section 4. Engineers enabling signatures unexplained boot requisition. Together they built a circle of complicity. None alone was proof. Together they formed a net. Laura read the binder with trembling hands. She asked Ellen if charges could follow. Ellen shook her head. Not criminal, civil maybe. They will argue every piece is coincidence. Laura closed the binder and whispered, "Coincidence does not leave fingerprints." Late one night, Ellen received a cassette tape mailed without return address. The recording captured plant radio chatter. A voice identified as Supervisor B ordered a quiet clear in Area B after an alarm. Another voice confirmed variants filed. The time stamp matched the day before Karen's crash. The handwriting on the variance request bore Breen's initials. The contractor guard reappeared near the rail yard. He avoided Ellen's eyes but spoke quietly. "Orders don't come written," he said. "They come from voices you don't question." She asked if Breen's was one of those voices. He said nothing, only flexed the scarred hand, then closed the door. At the courthouse, Laura pressed a copy of the badge reset log into the clerk's hands. The clerk returned it, saying the file was sealed under federal review. She left it on the desk. Hours later, the log was gone. The suspects remained visible yet untouchable. Breen smiled at civic luncheons. The guard patrolled the South Lot. Engineers walked hallways, clipboards in hand. The pickup sat parked behind chain-link fences. Each moved under the cover of normalcy, shielded by procedure, protected by silence. But forensic anchors held their shape. Forged strokes, scarred fingerprint, boot tread, GM paint code, cassette chatter. The net grew taut even as denial hardened. The final entry Ellen taped to her motel wall was a grainy photograph. Taken 3 nights before the crash, it showed Karen's lit apartment window. Across the street, blurred by distance, stood a figure in shadow. When enlarged, the outline matched the height and build of the contract guard. The image carried no face. Only the scarred hand could have left its print on Karen's journal. Only initials could have signed variants, reset, annotation. Only a truck could have struck her car. Evidence formed a circle, and in the circle's hub, the same letters returned. 2 initials pressed into every page. C. B. Under the glare of television cameras, Carrick Nuclear shifted into defense. A press officer in a tailored suit stood at a podium inside the Crescent Town Hall, speaking in carefully measured tones. "This was a tragic accident," he said, repeating the phrase 5 times in half an hour. He offered charts showing colorful bars of compliance, claimed Karen Ellison had been struggling with personal matters, and closed by emphasizing her blood alcohol level as if it were the only fact worth remembering. He answered no questions about glovebox alarms, variance logs, or badge resets. The cover-up began as narrative. Within days, major dailies printed short profiles of Karen, each heavy with the same phrases: erratic, reckless, unstable. None cited documents. All leaned on anonymous sources. When Ellen compared them, she saw identical language blocks, as if drafted from a template. She pinned them to her motel wall, circled the matching words. The script was too clean to be coincidence. A week later, a private firm arrived in Crescent, Baker and Stowe investigations. Their men asked neighbors about Karen's habits, visited her college campus, and contacted an ex-boyfriend. Soon after, newspapers quoted unnamed acquaintances describing her as emotional and prone to stress. The stories grew bolder, suggesting she might have caused the crash herself. The file folders in Ellen's possession, however, told the opposite. A woman who logged alarms with meticulous precision, who documented variances and initials, who underlined dates. At 10 p.m. on a Thursday, a janitor from the administration building called Ellen from a pay phone. He whispered about shredders running late into the night. He said black bags were hauled from the records office and left on a loading dock. One had split, spilling fragments of Carrick letterhead. He hung up before giving a name. Ellen and union colleague Mark found the dock 2 nights later. Against a concrete wall lay 3 bulging plastic bags, taped tight. One had torn at the seam. Through the gap, Ellen saw gray curls of paper, cut on diagonal, shredded twice. They lifted the smallest bag into her car and left quickly. In the newsroom, the bag spilled across a conference table. Shreds scattered like ash. Ellen called volunteers from the university. They worked through the night, arranging pieces with adhesive, edge to edge. By dawn, 3 pages had been partially restored. The first bore the heading Weekly Exposure Summary, Area B. Figures showed radiation badge readings well above federal limits. In the margin, values had been corrected downward in a rightward slanting hand. The correction matched the initials CB. The second page was a memo labeled Narrative Management. It instructed, coordinate with outside counsel, emphasize personal stressors, redirect technical questions to federal channels. A third fragment listed an agenda item, vendor check, 7:30 p.m., the exact time Breen recorded in his calendar on the night of the crash. Forensic anchors multiplied. The paper fibers carried the same copier blemish that marked earlier leaked pages. The correction loops matched handwriting from Karen's forged personnel file. The numbers, even after correction, still exceeded legal thresholds. Ellen photographed each page with a scale and timestamp card. Carrick's next move came wrapped in threat. Ellen's editor received a letter on official stationery warning of injunction for defamatory implication. It attached a glossy brochure with photographs of smiling workers and bold assurances of safety. Ellen turned the page in her hands. At the bottom corner, the familiar crescent-shaped copier scar appeared again. The same machine that had produced variance requests and exposure summaries had produced the public relations packet. Baker and Stowe escalated their intimidation. One evening, Ellen found a man waiting by her motel door. He introduced himself as Markham. He carried photographs of her walking into Laura Ellison's home. "People in grief deserve peace," he said, voice soft. "Your stories are harming them." He left a card embossed with his firm's logo. On the back was a single line handwritten in the same forward slant as the forged personnel note. "Truth has a cost." That same week, Laura received late-night calls. Each time the line rang, silence pressed at the other end. Once a voice whispered, "Stop for your family's sake." She unplugged the phone, locked the journal in a metal box, and slid it under her bed. The cover-up extended into the labs. The state facility that had analyzed Karen's doorknob swabs informed Ellen they could no longer accept private submissions. A memo claimed new compliance rules. It lacked signature, lacked letterhead. The paper's lower margin carried the same copier scar. Ellen filed it with the others. The next black bag appeared in an alley behind the administrative wing. Mark carried it in. This time, the shreds reassembled into a page headed South Lot Logistics. Among bullet points sat the line, "Pickup confirmed, Crescent split." The words matched the dispatcher's leaked call sheet that had ordered a vehicle to follow until Crescent split. Forensic overlays aligned the font spacing exactly. The fragments told a consistent story. Numbers altered, alarms silenced, logs rewritten, public narrative crafted to destroy Karen's credibility. And every piece carried the same fingerprints of production, the same copier scar, the same handwriting loops. Ellen wrote carefully. Her article listed only numbers, badge readings 3 times higher than limits, shredded memos ordering narrative management, and a schedule line placing Breen at the precise time of a suspicious pickup. She named no suspect, she accused no one, she documented. Carrick's lawyers responded with silence. They stopped returning calls, stopped attending local hearings. Instead, they mailed Crescent residents glossy mailers. On the front, smiling families. On the back, the line, "Accidents happen. Safety is our priority." At the corner, again, the same scar. The truth of the cover-up no longer rested on testimony. It rested on artifacts, shredded pages, copier marks, corrected numbers, erased memos. The evidence of concealment was now more abundant than the evidence of the accident itself. One night, Ellen turned off her motel light and stared at the board. Pages of reconstructed fragments hung in rows. Photographs of copier scars lined the edges. At the center, circled twice in red, were 2 initials. Every thread, every correction, every erased number returned to the same pair. The cover-up had a face, even if it hid behind paper. The last shred Ellen taped down carried 12 letters in bold type. "Do not copy, confidential." Beneath it, a half-visible signature began with a C and ended with a B. The signature was incomplete, but the initials were not. By winter, the lines no longer pointed only to a plant. They pointed outward into offices where reports were received and silenced, where alarms became paperwork. Ellen Rivers began filing Freedom of Information Act requests. The responses arrived weeks later. Thick envelopes with pages blacked out until they looked like charred paper. Even so, enough survived to expose a wider network. One document dated September recorded a meeting in Washington between Carrick executives and officials from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The subject line read, "Variance Reporting Protocols." Entire paragraphs were redacted, but a single note remained. Industry partners request adjustment of incident thresholds. Avoid unnecessary public concern. The phrasing mirrored Carrick's press officer, who had dismissed glovebox alarms as nuisance noise. Ellen circled the repetition. Another file, stamped confidential, listed participants in a community engagement strategy. Alongside Carrick executives sat representatives of a lobbying group known for funneling money into congressional races. Attached receipts showed hotel bills, steakhouse dinners, and taxi vouchers in Washington. The same week Karen's urine bioassay registered positive for plutonium. The lobbyists' invoices carried signatures from Carrick's legal department. Forensic anchors proliferated. One hotel receipt dated October 12 carried Breen's initials in the margin, his handwriting tilted right. The same scarred copier blemish marked the receipt's corner. Ellen placed it beside the variance logs. The network reached into media as well. Ellen discovered a faxed narrative sheet distributed to 3 local editors. The sheet contained bullet points. Emphasize alcohol level, note erratic attendance, avoid technical detail. One editor off record admitted he had used the sheet as a guide. The fax header revealed an origin line, a lobbying office in Washington. Laura Ellison read these documents with disbelief. They didn't just smear her here, she whispered. They smeared her across the whole country. She placed the journal beside the receipts, her sister's handwriting stacked against corporate bills. The juxtaposition was brutal. Karen's ink lines about strange cars and alarms, next to neat receipts for fillets and martinis. The paper's lawyer demanded chain of custody detail again. Ellen produced envelope stamps, FOIA tracking numbers, the shredded documents reconstructed under plexiglass. He nodded and marked them admissible. "They can argue relevance," he said. "They can't erase the paper." The most chilling find came from a memo titled Containment Strategy. Black bars covered most of it, but one line survived. Coordinate with NRC contacts, delay Crescent site inspection. The inspection in question was scheduled for November 15. Karen died on November 13. Ellen confirmed through public docket that the inspection had indeed been rescheduled, postponed 6 weeks with no explanation. When it finally occurred, the inspectors reported no significant deviations. By then, contaminated surfaces in Karen's home had been scrubbed or sealed, evidence dispersed. The timing spoke louder than the redactions. A contractor leaked another fragment, a photocopied badge log showing reset entries for multiple workers. 3 of the resets carried Breen's initials, but at the bottom of the page, an NRC reviewer had signed approved. The initials belonged to a federal inspector. Ellen placed the copy beside the variance reports. Forensic comparison showed the same copier scar. The paper that erased Karen's evidence also carried the federal seal. Mark explained what it meant. They had help, he said, not just here, higher up. His voice carried no surprise, only exhaustion. The network extended even further. A lobbyist's expense form listed a dinner with Sen, J. On November 2, a line item noted discuss Crescent concerns. 10 days later, Karen's car left the highway. The lobbyist's reimbursement form bore initials consistent with Carrick's counsel. Ellen traced the money. Campaign contributions from Carrick's parent company clustered around the same dates. Funds routed through committees arrived in Senate accounts within days of the dinner. The amounts were large enough to secure silence, small enough to hide among hundreds of donations. She built a new wall chart. At the center sat Karen's crash. From its stretched threads to Carrick's supervisors, to contract security to lobbyists to regulators to senators. Each thread carried a forensic anchor, scarred fingerprints, shredded memos, receipts, fax headers, copier scars. Each node connected. Each page matched. One evening, Ellen checked her mailbox and found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page, heavily redacted from an NRC internal communication. Amid the blacked-out lines stood one chilling sentence: "Ensure Crescent matter handled quietly, avoid precedent." No signature, only a date stamp, November 14, the day after Karen's death. The sheriff refused to reopen the case. He cited jurisdiction. "Federal matter now," he said. Laura asked him if federal silence counted as justice. He had no answer. At night, Laura walked past her niece's bedroom, where the contaminated brass lamp sat sealed in a box. She imagined invisible particles still clinging to its surface. "They reached into her house," she whispered, "and still they say nothing." The cover-up had widened into a network of silence, reinforced by money, paperwork, and redactions. What began with a crash on a rural highway now stretched into federal offices and lobbyist dinners. Each link carried marks of its passage, initials in margins, receipts stamped with codes, fax headers, copier scars. Ellen pinned the latest page on her wall, redactions thick as tar. Only a single line remained legible. It read, "This matter never existed." The words glowed under the lamp. The network had spoken. The survivors carried silence like contamination. After the crash, the Carrick plant resumed operations with no interruption. Machines hummed, badge readers clicked, trucks idled at the south lot. But in kitchens and bedrooms across Crescent, the workers who remained lived with shadows of exposure, shadows of fear. Laura Ellison became the reluctant steward of her sister's memory. She moved Karen's belongings into sealed boxes, each labeled with date and location. The brass lamp wrapped in towels, the toothbrush in a sterile bag, the journal in its locked metal case. Each item felt like a relic and a hazard. She placed them in her spare room and opened the window at night as if air could dilute what lingered. Union workers whispered of illnesses. One technician described sores that would not heal. Another spoke of headaches that pulsed after each shift. A woman in laundry services noticed her hair thinning. None would file formal complaints. "They'll call it stress," one said. Another muttered, "They'll call it coincidence." They lived in quiet houses, curtains drawn, their health logged only in family memory. Ellen Rivers pressed for testimonies. Most refused names, but a few spoke under promise of anonymity. One described being ordered to sign incident logs retroactively. Another admitted to falsifying readings on a supervisor's instructions. A third claimed he had seen men in plain jackets removing boxes from the union office basement after hours. Their voices trembled as they spoke. Each feared losing more than health, losing livelihood, insurance, their homes. Forensic anchors survived even when people did not speak. Ellen received a sealed envelope at her newsroom desk containing a DNA analysis from a university lab. The sample tested was a strand of hair taken from Karen's pillowcase. Embedded in the follicle were traces of plutonium isotopes, consistent with the same material found in her workstation glove box. The analyst's note was plain: no natural pathway for this transfer except contaminated environment. Laura stared at the lab report until tears blurred the print. They followed her home, she whispered. She folded the page and placed it in the journal's box. Karen's colleagues left small gestures: a single flower at the culvert, a coin on the courthouse steps, an anonymous note taped to the union door. She was right. They left no signatures, only acts. Ellen published stories that grew colder in tone. She described alpha spectrometry graphs, badge resets, variance logs, shredded documents reassembled. She described DNA findings from household objects. She avoided adjectives, avoided speculation. Each piece stacked like bricks in a wall. Readers called them dry, but those who knew recognized the weight. Federal response arrived as silence. Letters acknowledging her FOIA requests carried heavy black redactions. Each envelope felt heavier than its contents. One, stamped November 14, contained a single visible line: Crescent matter, avoid precedent. Another carried nothing but a page number. Meanwhile, the community fractured. Some sided with Carrick, repeating the narrative of accident, alcohol, instability. They feared for jobs, for paychecks that kept mortgages afloat. Others sided with Laura, whispering that Karen had been murdered. Families split. Dinner tables grew quiet. Children overheard fragments they did not understand. What's plutonium? One boy asked his mother. She told him to finish his homework. Laura lived under a sense of intrusion. She noticed cars idling near her driveway, strangers lingering too long at grocery aisles. Once she found her mailbox open, letters damp from rain. She kept the journal's key on a chain under her blouse and slept lightly. The survivors within the plant lived in constant vigilance. They washed hands obsessively, checked doorknobs with sleeves, avoided sitting at breakroom tables. Some carried personal dosimeters purchased privately. One man kept his locked in a drawer at home, checking the numbers each evening before sleep. Ellen documented these habits. She wrote about rituals of fear: windows nailed shut, water boiled before drinking, clothes burned after contamination drills. She called it a community of survivors. But the editors cut the phrase. They wanted numbers, not metaphors. She restored the phrase anyway in her notes. The lawsuit loomed. Civil attorneys began building cases around negligence, around exposure, around concealed evidence. They requested documents Ellen had already collected. She turned them over carefully, logging chain of custody. One attorney remarked that the binder she built reads like pathology. Ellen nodded. Laura attended union meetings where the air felt heavy. Men and women avoided her gaze. She stood and asked why no one spoke. Silence filled the room. Finally, one man said, "We have families." She answered, so did she. Forensic echoes continued to surface. A nurse slipped Ellen a copy of a medical record showing elevated bioassay results for 3 workers, all from the same week Karen died. The records bore red stamps: administrative error. The nurse whispered, "They're not errors, they're evidence." Ellen filed the records, photographed the stamps, circled the ink loops. She added them to her wall, another thread in the network. The survivors bore witness in fragments: a glance, a whisper, a document slipped under a door. They could not speak loudly, but they spoke enough. Laura carried her niece to school each morning, passing the culvert on Highway 74. The child asked why flowers were always there. Laura said because someone was lost. She did not say murdered, did not say silenced. She simply drove on, watching the curve where tire tracks once cut through mud. The town's division hardened into ritual. Some families crossed the street to avoid Laura. Others pressed notes into her hand. Every note read the same: keep going. The truth spread slowly, like contamination itself, unseen, inhaled, incorporated into tissue. Survivors knew. They bore it in coughs, in bruises, in sleepless eyes. They carried it without speaking. At night, Laura sat by the locked box, journal inside. She listened to the silence, to the hum of appliances, to her own breath. She remembered her sister writing late into the night, pen scratching across paper, recording alarms, variances, initials. She imagined the hand pausing mid-sentence, the line ending unfinished. The survivors lived in unfinished sentences too. Forensic reports filled the silence: hair with isotopes, DNA from toothbrush bristles, alpha spectrometry peaks, bioassay results stamped error. Paper did not forget even when people did. On Laura's nightstand, beside the locked box, sat the sealed bag containing Karen's toothbrush. Its bristles glowed faintly under forensic lamp. It would never brush again. The courthouse in Oklahoma City stood in red stone silence, its steps worn smooth by decades of feet. In the spring of 1979, nearly 5 years after the crash on Highway 74, Laura Ellison walked those steps carrying a box of sealed evidence bags. Inside were the fragments her sister had left behind: the toothbrush with plutonium traces, the journal, the reconstructed memos pulled from shredded paper. They were not weapons, but they felt heavy in her hands. The case was civil, not criminal. No indictment had ever been filed. The state insisted Karen's death was a traffic accident. The federal government deferred to ongoing regulatory review. Only through civil court could the family push the truth into daylight. Attorneys for the Ellison family built their opening argument on contamination. They projected photographs of alpha spectrometry graphs onto courtroom screens. The jagged peaks glowed like mountains. "This is what came home on her hands," an expert testified, pointing at the peaks. "This is why plutonium particles were found on her toothbrush, her doorknob, her kitchen table. These are not numbers from imagination. These are numbers from analysis." The defense objected. They argued chain of custody was flawed. They said samples had been mishandled, results exaggerated. But when the judge asked if the lab equipment had been faulty, they offered no proof. The family's attorney then produced the journal. He held it up gloved, pages stiff from handling. He read aloud Karen's entries, her description of phone calls that ended in silence, cars idling outside, initials written beside glovebox alarms. The courtroom hushed. Even the defense team shifted uneasily as the final unfinished line was read. "Meeting tonight, deliver copies. Don't trust." The sentence broke like a fracture, ink trailing into nothing. Witnesses followed. Union colleague Mark Drayton described Karen's fears, her insistence that safety reports were falsified. A nurse testified about urine bioassays marked administrative error. An independent handwriting analyst explained that the forged annotation in Karen's personnel file matched the initials on variance logs. He displayed overlays, transparent sheets showing loops and slants aligning perfectly. Forensic anchors filled the room. A photograph of the culvert showed the gouged soil where a second set of tires had cut beside Karen's. Enlarged paint flecks revealed GM code from a dark pickup. The tail light fragment was passed hand to hand, its edges jagged, its surface stained with metallic blue. The jury leaned forward to see. The defense countered with character. They painted Karen as unstable, reckless, overwhelmed. They displayed photographs of her Honda Civic, twisted beyond recognition, and repeated the blood alcohol number again and again. "This," their lawyer said, pointing at the car, "is not conspiracy. This is tragedy." They called a plant executive who insisted safety standards were exemplary. They called a former friend who claimed Karen had been drinking more than usual. But each claim bent under the weight of paper. The exposure summary reconstructed from shredded strips showed badge readings triple the federal limit. The memo, titled Narrative Management, instructed executives to emphasize personal stressors in press coverage. When asked on cross-examination whether this meant shaping Karen's reputation after her death, the executive on the stand faltered. It was a communication plan, he admitted. The judge ordered the jury to focus only on negligence, not on murder, not on conspiracy. Still, the evidence spoke its own language. Shredded documents pieced back together, numbers corrected downward in the same slanting hand, alpha peaks from household objects. Each fragment was a brick in a wall. In closing arguments, the Ellison attorney did not use adjectives. He used dates. October 12, hotel receipt, Washington lobbyist dinner. October 14, variance log, initials CB. November 13, crash on Highway 74. November 14, inspection postponed. These are not rumors, he said. These are records. They cannot explain themselves away. The defense replied with one phrase repeated 12 times, operator error. After 3 weeks, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Laura sat with her hands clasped, the journal's key pressed into her palm. The foreman read the verdict: Carrick Nuclear found liable for negligence. Damages awarded $3 million. No finding of criminal responsibility. No names named. No initials spoken aloud. Laura did not cry. She listened as the judge adjourned and the gavel struck. The courtroom emptied, lawyers shaking hands, reporters scribbling headlines. She stayed seated, staring at the enlarged graph still faintly glowing on the projection screen. Peaks and valleys, cold numbers that had followed her sister home. Outside, cameras crowded. A reporter shouted, "Is this justice?" Laura answered only, "It is acknowledgement." She carried the evidence box back down the steps. Inside the courthouse, the defense table sat empty, chairs pushed back, exhibits packed away. On the desk lay a single forgotten item, the courtroom exhibit enlargement of the plutonium readings. The graph's peaks towered above the baseline, black lines etched against white. In the silence, the lines looked less like data and more like mountains no one had climbed. The courtroom lights flicked off. The graph glowed in memory. The verdict did not end the story. It only shifted its weight. After the judgment, Crescent, Oklahoma lived with a strange dual silence. One side insisting justice had been served, the other whispering that nothing had truly changed. Carrick Nuclear paid the $3 million, wrote checks with neat signatures, then resumed operations as though a life had not been broken on Highway 74. Laura Ellison received the settlement with a mixture of relief and despair. The money could pay for her niece's schooling, for medical bills, for survival. It could not erase the image of her sister's car crushed against the culvert, the manila folder scattered, the missing pages that never returned. Each night she opened the locked metal box beneath her bed, not to count money, but to touch the journal. Its unfinished sentence remained the truest record she possessed. The community split further. Workers who relied on Carrick's paychecks defended the company. It was an accident, they said, in diners, at ball games, at church. Families of the sick whispered otherwise. They spoke of headaches, sores, hair falling in clumps. They spoke of neighbors gone pale, of funerals too soon, but none filed claims. To speak publicly was to risk livelihood, and silence was safer currency. Ellen Rivers continued to publish. Her stories grew colder, sharper, stripped of adjectives. She wrote about badge resets, shredded memos, lobbying receipts. She wrote about federal inspections delayed until evidence evaporated. She ended one article with a single sentence: "What was erased remains present in the bodies of workers." The line sparked outrage in some quarters, dismissal in others. Forensic anchors kept surfacing even after the trial. A former NRC clerk mailed Ellen a redacted memo stamped November 14, 1974, the day after the crash. Only one sentence escaped the black bars: "Ensure Crescent matter handled quietly, avoid precedent." Another envelope contained a copy of a hotel receipt signed with Breen's initials, dated the same week as the variance logs. These scraps carried no legal power, but they bound the narrative tighter, proof that the network extended well beyond Crescent. Laura found herself watched. She noticed cars parked near her driveway, engines idling too long. Twice, she returned home to find her mailbox open. She began recording license plates in a notebook, just as Karen had. At night, she locked every door, checked windows twice, left lights burning in empty rooms. Fear had become ritual. The broader community bore scars. Children at the elementary school asked why their parents whispered the word radiation. One boy brought home a flyer from the company showing smiling workers and the slogan, "Safety is our priority." His mother threw it into the trash, then pulled it back out, flattened it, and slipped it into a drawer. She feared to forget, feared to remember. The settlement never answered the central question: what happened between the Union Hall at 7:30 p.m. and the culvert at 9:05 p.m.? The official record said accident. The forensic anchors said otherwise. A second set of tire marks, paint flecks from a dark pickup, a tail light fragment with GM code. The truth hovered like fallout, invisible but persistent. In 1980, the plant reduced operations, citing economic pressure. Some workers transferred, others were laid off. Houses went up for sale. Crescent emptied slowly, its streets quiet, its stores closing one by one. Laura stayed. She tended the grave with fresh flowers, always white. She left coins on the headstone, small markers of unfinished debt. Ellen moved on to other investigations but returned each year to speak with Laura. They would sit at the kitchen table, journal between them, discussing what had changed and what had not. They wanted silence, Ellen said once, but silence doesn't erase records. She tapped the scarred copier corner still visible on one reconstructed memo. Paper remembers. The aftermath stretched beyond Crescent. Advocacy groups cited Karen's case in campaigns for whistleblower protections. Congressional hearings mentioned an Oklahoma technician silenced. But names were omitted, initials buried in transcripts. The systemic lesson was spoken carefully. Safety reports required oversight, corporate secrecy demanded restraint. Yet no one in authority said her name on record. For the Ellison family, the aftermath was both closure and wound. They won damages but lost faith. They proved contamination but not murder. They exposed a network but saw it continue. At night, Laura sometimes stood at the culvert. She watched headlights pass, watched tire beams cut across asphalt. The soil where Karen's car had veered still held faint depressions. Rain had filled them, grass had grown, but the lines remained. She imagined a dark pickup trailing close behind, invisible in the mirror until too late. In her hand she carried a photograph, Karen smiling at age 20, standing in a lab coat holding a clipboard. The photo's edges curled, its surface faintly speckled from age. Laura kept it in her wallet, her last anchor to the person before the file, before the smear, before the accident that was not accident. The story's end was not resolution but persistence. Every record, every page, every shred reassembled spoke of a truth officially denied but physically real. The jury's verdict wrote negligence. The network wrote silence. The survivors lived in between, bearing fragments as proof. On her last visit to the courthouse, Laura climbed the empty steps. She found the exhibit enlargement of the plutonium readings still stored in a forgotten drawer. Peaks rose above baseline black lines on white. She folded the graph carefully, slid it into her box with the journal and toothbrush. She whispered, "They cannot erase you." Crescent aged into obscurity, but the contamination did not. It seeped beneath groundwater, beneath memory, beneath silence. Warnings were posted on fences, "Do not drink the water." The signs rusted, paint peeling, but the message remained. The aftermath was not closure, it was continuity. The culvert still stood at the highway bend. Flowers appeared each year, tied to the guardrail. Passing headlights illuminated them for seconds at a time before darkness returned. One night, Laura placed the journal beside the flowers, left it sealed in its box, and walked away. She did not look back. Behind her, the wind turned pages that no one would ever read again.